Anarcha Westcott was a person, a woman, but history rarely speaks of her that way. Her name is known, but not for the life she lived. It is remembered for what was done to her. She was an enslaved woman in Alabama, handed over to a doctor who saw her not as a patient, but as an experiment. She endured procedure after procedure, without anesthesia, without a choice. Dr. James Marion Sims became a celebrated pioneer of modern gynecology. His name is honored, his legacy preserved. But Anarcha, the woman whose suffering made his success possible, was nearly erased. And here's something you might not know. Anarcha Westcott wasn't even her original name. Her story definitely deserves more than silence. History may have overlooked her, but we won't. So please, kindly give this video a like to show your support, and join us as we explore the remarkable story of Anarcha Westcott. Anarcha Westcott was born into a world where nothing belonged to her. Not her freedom, not her future, not even her body. She was an enslaved woman in 19th century Alabama, a time when human lives were treated as property, valued only for the labor they could produce. She was owned by a plantation holder named Mr. Westcott. Records indicate that Anarcha was born around 1828 on the Westcott plantation in Montgomery, Alabama. She was the fourth of 5 children born to her parents, Jerry and Sue, who were also enslaved. Their names appear in an 1828 estate inventory created after the death of David Westcott, the original owner of the plantation. At the time, the South operated on a debt economy, meaning that when Westcott died without a will, his estate, including the enslaved people he owned, had to be carefully documented so his debts could be settled. The 1828 estate inventory listed 29 enslaved people in detail, breaking them down into family groups and assigning them monetary value. Anarcha, whose name was originally listed as Anarcha, appeared in the inventory as part of her family unit. Her parents, Jerry and Sue, and her siblings, Manuel, Mary, Ben, and Joe. Together, they were valued at $1,500, making up approximately 15% of the entire worth of the Westcott plantation. This suggests that her mother, Sue, was regularly forced to bear children, a common practice on plantations that profited from increasing the enslaved population. When David Westcott died, his widow, Eliza Westcott, took control of the plantation, raising their 4 children while managing the enslaved laborers. For more than a decade, she continued expanding the estate, and by 1841, the number of enslaved people had grown from 29 to about 80, many of them children born on the plantation. Clearly, the Westcotts were actively engaged in breeding slaves to increase their wealth. In 1841, when the plantation's enslaved population was formally divided among the Westcott heirs, Anarcha, now about 13 years old, was given to William R. Westcott, the second oldest son. In plantation documents from that year, her name appeared as Anarchy. The inconsistency in these records shows how little enslaved individuals were regarded as people. Names could be changed, misspelled, or lost entirely because their identities were never considered significant. Contrary to popular belief, she also never took the name Westcott. Unlike other slaves who adopted their enslaver's last name, no primary source document links her to that surname. The name Anarcha Westcott appears only in modern references, but it was never one she claimed for herself. By the age of 13, Anarcha was approaching the stage where she would be expected to reproduce and increase the plantation's enslaved population. Enslaved girls were often forced into childbirth as soon as they were physically capable, and Anarcha was no exception. By the age of 17, Anarcha became pregnant, but whether her later pregnancies resulted from forced pairing with another enslaved man or sexual abuse by a member of the Westcott family is unknown, as both were widespread practices in the South at the time. When she went into labor, a doctor named James Marion Sims was called to the plantation to assist in the delivery. According to him, she had been in labor for 3 days, suffering from prolonged obstructed labor, a condition in which the baby cannot pass through the birth canal. Sims used forceps to deliver the baby, a dangerous procedure, even by today's medical standards. Whether the child survived is uncertain. Sim's own account does not mention the baby beyond saying that it was delivered with ease, which may suggest a stillbirth. Given the nature of her labor, the likelihood of the baby surviving was extremely low. What is certain is that Anarcha survived, but with devastating injuries. The prolonged labor left her with a vesicovaginal fistula, an opening between the bladder and the vaginal wall that caused constant incontinence. The condition was common among women who endured obstructed labor, but for an enslaved woman like Anarcha, it meant something even worse. She was now regarded as damaged property. Her condition threatened her usefulness on the plantation, and for William Westcott, that was a problem. Like many enslavers, he was not concerned with her suffering. He was concerned with what he was losing. If Anarcha could not work, if she could not bear more children, then she was no longer a profitable investment. So he gave her to Dr. James Marion Sims, who had begun focusing on gynecological conditions. At the time, Sims had little formal experience in the field, but he was eager to experiment. For Anarcha, this may have seemed like a chance to be healed, but what awaited her was something else entirely. Dr. James Marion Sims was not a man driven by mercy. He was driven by ego and greed. His career up to that point had been unremarkable, and he was desperate for a discovery that would elevate him to greatness. Even before Anarcha was sent to him, he was already experimenting on other enslaved individuals in brutal ways. He had been investigating infant lockjaw and performing major surgeries on cancers of the face and jaw, procedures he hoped would bring him recognition. In one case, Sims attempted to remove a cancerous jawbone from an enslaved man. He gave him 60 drops of opium for the pain, but began the surgery before the drug had time to take effect. Why? Because his goal was not to ease suffering, but to study his technique. As the man writhed in pain, Sims had a sketch artist record each step, ensuring that his methods could later be published and studied by other surgeons. Sims wrote about these cases, not as a man reflecting on the pain he caused, but as a surgeon advertising his skill. One of his proudest claims was that his method of operation did not require a patient to be willing at all. This was a virtue in his eyes. He had found a way to perform major surgery without consent, and just weeks later, Anarcha was sent to him. When Anarcha arrived at Sims' clinic, she was not alone. Other enslaved women, including two known as Betsy and Lucy, were also brought to him. They were all suffering from vesicovaginal fistula. Anarcha was the first woman Sims saw with this condition. Shortly after, Betsy, who was enslaved by a man named Dr. Harris, was brought to Sims with the same injury. Then came Lucy, owned by a man named Tom Zimmerman from Macon County. The three women became the foundation of his infamous experiments. At first, Sims dismissed them. He sent them away, uninterested in their suffering, because he had no idea how to treat their condition. He admitted as much himself. He had never encountered vesicovaginal fistula before and had no experience with gynecological surgery. Like most doctors of the time, he saw little value in attempting to heal enslaved women. They were not patients to him. They were disposable bodies, and he had no use for them until he realized that their suffering could serve his ambition. One day, Sims claimed to have a revelation about how he might cure fistulas. He was treating a white woman with a dislocated uterus when he repositioned her on her hands and knees to get a better view. That was when he realized that if he could see into the vaginal canal more clearly, he could attempt a surgical repair on a fistula. He had not been thinking about Anarcha, Betsy, or Lucy when he had his so-called breakthrough. He had already discarded them, but now he saw a way to make them useful again, not for their own healing, not to ease their suffering, but to serve his reputation. So he summoned them back to serve as his test subjects. He was now determined to develop a surgical procedure to repair fistulas, but he had no intention of treating his subjects with dignity. He did not follow even the limited medical ethics of his time. He performed his experiments without anesthesia, not because it wasn't available, but because he simply didn't care. Ether, an anesthetic, was already in use, and Sims himself would later write extensively about the history of anesthesia. He knew it worked. He even administered opium to white women undergoing surgery. But when it came to enslaved women, he let them feel every cut, every stitch, every failure. There is a common misconception that Sims operated on enslaved people without anesthesia because he believed they didn't feel pain the way white people did. While such medical myths about black people and pain tolerance certainly existed at the time, Sims's own actions prove he did not believe this. He was fully aware of their pain, and he used it to his advantage. Pain to him was not an obstacle, nor was it a moral obligation to prevent. It was part of his process. Sims needed them conscious, aware, and suffering so he could study their reactions in real time. If they cried out, he took note. If they convulsed, he observed. He forced them to hold each other down, using their own bodies to keep one another still as he experimented on them. They weren't people to him, they were tools, and the space he created for his experiments made that clear. The conditions were brutal. Sims carried out procedures in a small backyard hospital of his own making. Medical advancements had not yet developed sterilization practices, and he often operated with unclean instruments. When Anarcha and the others screamed, when their bodies fought back against the pain, it didn't stop him. It only made them more useful to him. Anarcha underwent at least 30 operations over the course of 4 years. These were not minor procedures. They involved cutting, suturing, and repeated failures. Sims described her as enduring them with patience, as if that meant she had agreed to them. But she had no say. She was enslaved. Consent was never part of the equation. Sims himself rarely claimed otherwise. On the rare occasion that he mentioned obtaining consent, he referred only to the enslavers of Anarcha, Lucy, Betsy, and the others, never to the women themselves. To make matters even worse, Sims didn't operate in private. He turned their suffering into a spectacle, performing surgeries on them while other doctors and medical students watched. He wanted an audience, people who could witness his so-called innovations. There was no concern for ethics, no thought given to the agony of the women on the table. His notes on Anarcha's repeated procedures mention his frustrations, not at the pain he was causing, but at his own failures. He operated on her again and again, adjusting his technique each time. When he finally succeeded in closing a fistula, he credited himself with a breakthrough. And once he had what he wanted, he considered his experimental phase complete and stopped operating on her altogether. Anarcha's suffering was merely documented as part of his process. After Sims perfected his method, he simply moved on. He began treating white women for similar conditions, this time using anesthesia. The suffering he once ignored became something he suddenly sought to prevent as soon as his patients were no longer slaves. For many years, the fate of Anarcha and the other women after the experiments ended in 1849 remained vague. Despite the many doctors and medical students who observed Sims's work, none ever mentioned meeting Anarcha, Lucy, or Betsy again. Even Sims's longtime assistant doctor, Nathan Bozeman, who worked with him in 1849, never wrote of seeing them again. What is known is that during Sims' experiments, Anarcha and possibly other women were transferred to a wealthy enslaver named Dr. Nathan Harris, who was the original enslaver of Betsy. A legal document from 1847 shows that Harris transferred ownership of Anarcha to his soon-to-be wife, Margaret Duncan, placing her under the legal control of George Goldthwait. During this time, Goldthwait frequently leased enslaved individuals for labor, including at Montgomery Hall, the city's largest hotel. Records suggest that Anarcha was among those sent there, where she worked as a nurse, tending not only to doctors, but also to William Rufus King, a U.S. senator who would later become Vice President of the United States. In a letter from this period, Sims described King being cared for by the kindest and best nurse. In a rare moment, he wrote Anarcha's name in his own handwriting. Anarcha, our Anarcha. Sims, known for embellishing details in his medical writings, rarely mentioned Anarcha outside of his case studies, but the way he phrased it, our Anarcha, suggests something more personal. Actually, this wasn't the first time he had written about someone named Anarcha. Years earlier, in an early passage of his autobiography, Sims described being gravely ill with malaria in 1836, not long after arriving in Alabama. He recalled a young enslaved girl who sat by his side through the night, tending to him while others around them succumbed to illness. Though he never explicitly identified her as the same Anarcha who would later become the subject of his experiments, he never denied it either. The name Anarcha was rare, and if she had been a child in 1836, she would have been around 17 when Sims began his first fistula experiments in 1845. That connection became even clearer years later when Sims wrote to a man who had recently been under Anarcha's care. When he underlined the words, "Our Anarcha," he was seemingly acknowledging that he, too, had once been cared for by her. This confirms that Anarcha had been trained as a nurse from a young age, entrusted with medical responsibilities long before Sims ever performed surgery on her. The very man whose life she had once helped save would later subject her to years of unrelenting agony, operating on her without anesthesia, using her body as a test subject in his pursuit of medical fame. She had once kept him alive, and he made sure she suffered. James Marion Sims eventually became famous and built a career on what he called medical innovation. He established hospitals, published research, and became known as a pioneer in gynecology. His name was written into history as a doctor who changed the field. His techniques were taught in medical schools. Statues were erected in his honor, including a bronze figure in New York's Central Park, standing proudly among the city's greats. His reputation was built on the procedures he perfected through repeated operations on Anarcha and other enslaved women in his backyard hospital, and he eventually became one of the world's first celebrity surgeons. The women who endured his experiments, Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, were not recognized as medical pioneers. They were not credited for their unwilling role in medical progress. They were left behind, their suffering treated as a necessary step in Sims' rise to prominence. For over 170 years, Sims remained the only source that Anarcha had even existed, until historical records finally revealed the truth of her origins. The 1828 Westcott Plantation estate inventory became the first verifiable proof of her existence, beyond Sims' self-serving accounts. Anarcha's name was nearly erased from history, distorted and buried over time. Yet, despite the alterations and deliberate omissions, her story endures, not because of those who exploited her, but because of those who insist on remembering. The end of Sims' experiments in Alabama did not mark the end of Anarcha's suffering. She did not remain in Montgomery, nor was she left in peace after Sims was done with her. Instead, her life became a series of forced relocations, repeated medical experiments, and continued exploitation, eventually revealed over the years through historical records and researchers who have uncovered the details of her life beyond Sims' accounts. Sims claimed that he had successfully cured Anarcha's fistula, and for more than a century, medical literature repeated this claim, portraying her as his first great success. But the truth was much different. Years after Sims's experiments in Alabama ended, Anarcha appeared in hospital records in New York City, still suffering from the same condition she had endured years of brutal surgeries to fix. At some point in the early 1850s, Anarcha was taken to Virginia, where she came under the ownership of William L. Maury, a member of the influential Maury family, known for their ties to the Confederate Navy. How she came into Maury's possession is not fully documented, but historical records indicate that she was sold or transferred from Dr. Nathan Harris. Harris, like many enslavers, may have sold Anarcha as part of a financial or political transaction, further severing her ties to her home state and any remaining connections she had in Alabama. Anarcha's move to Virginia did not bring her relief. She was not placed in a household, but was instead experimented on once again, this time by Dr. Charles Bell Gibson, a surgeon in Richmond who had been studying obstetric fistula and was well aware of Sims's work. Unlike Sims, Gibson had access to chloroform and used it as anesthesia during his procedures on Anarcha. While this meant that Anarcha was no longer forced to endure surgery while fully conscious, it did not change the fact that she was still being subjected to non-consensual experimentation. Her time in Richmond was spent at the Egyptian Building, a facility connected to the Medical College of Virginia. The Egyptian Building housed both a hospital and a medical school, making it a place where doctors in training observed surgeries, including experimental procedures like the ones performed on Anarcha. After enduring additional medical experiments, Anarcha was moved yet again, this time to New York City, where she was placed in Woman's Hospital, the institution founded by Sims himself. By this point, Sims was no longer her attending physician, but she entered the hospital system he had created, subjected to further medical procedures. Records from the hospital show that she was admitted in December 1856, her case noted as a continuation of the experimental treatment she had undergone in Alabama. Sims, who had built his reputation on his so-called cure for fistula, had every incentive to keep Anarcha's continued suffering out of public knowledge. If she was still experiencing complications, it would call his entire claim of success into question. Yet, despite his efforts to maintain his myth, Anarcha's presence in the New York hospital records proves that she was never fully healed. By early 1857, Anarcha was sent to Bowling Green, Virginia, where she lived on Old Mansion, the Maury family plantation. There, she worked as a midwife, helping deliver the children of both enslaved and white women. Though she had been subjected to years of brutal experimentation, she was expected to use her knowledge to aid others in childbirth, all while continuing to suffer from the long-term effects of her surgeries. She remained at Old Mansion for several years, giving birth to more children of her own. Throughout her life, Anarcha had at least 10 pregnancies. Her daughter Delia, born around 1851, remained with her. Her later children, William, Oliver, and Elizabeth, appeared in later records. The others, likely born before or during her time in Richmond and New York, either did not survive or were sold away. During the Civil War, as the Maury family's financial situation worsened, Anarcha was leased out once again. In around 1863 to 1864, she was sent to the Alto Plantation in King George, Virginia, under the control of Charles Mason. Leasing out enslaved laborers was a common practice, especially among families who could no longer afford to maintain a full workforce. By this time, Anarcha's health had severely declined. In 1864, Mason wrote to James T. White, the previous owner of Old Mansion, describing Anarcha as sickly and unable to perform much work. Yet despite her poor health, she was not alone. Mason's letter also mentioned that she had children with her and a husband who doted on her, a man named Lorenzi. Anarcha and Lorenzi met during this period, possibly through their forced relocations between plantations, as Alto was known for its horse racing connections and frequently hosted visitors from other estates. Despite the cruel circumstances of their lives, they formed a bond and built a family together. When the war ended in 1865 and enslaved people were legally freed, Anarcha remained in King George with Lorenzi and their children. Though she was no longer enslaved, her body had been permanently damaged by years of surgeries, forced labor, and neglect. By this time, Anarcha no longer went by the name that had been assigned to her in Alabama. Records from Virginia refer to her as Anarcha Jackson, reflecting the new life she built for herself after slavery. Whether she chose this name herself, or whether it was a variation used by those around her, it was the name that followed her into the years after the war. She died in 1870, just a few years after emancipation. Her official death record lists the cause as asthma. However, this diagnosis is questionable. Given the experiments performed on her in Richmond, where chloroform was used as an anesthetic, it is possible that her respiratory system had been permanently damaged. Chloroform was still experimental at the time, and improper use could cause severe lung complications, including a bloody cough. Anarcha's death may have been the result of long-term medical neglect, rather than the simple respiratory condition listed in her records. Her final resting place was a simple grave in the woods of the former Alto Plantation. Her husband, Lorenzi, continued to live there for many years, and in 1884, he was buried beside her. Today, their graves remain largely forgotten, hidden in the dense Virginia forest, a quiet testimony to a life that history nearly erased. As for whether Anarcha has any living descendants, that remains unknown. While she had children, records do not indicate whether her lineage continued beyond her lifetime. Some of her children may have died young, while others could have been sold away before emancipation, their names lost to time. What is certain is that Anarcha's suffering did not end when Sims' experiments did, nor was she ever given the dignity of healing. Her body bore the cost of medical advancements she never agreed to, and in return, history nearly erased her. But even though her name was nearly lost, her story continues to be uncovered, piece by piece, record by record, so that she is no longer just a footnote in another man's legacy. Years went by since then, but the beliefs that allowed her suffering to happen did not disappear. They lingered. They embedded themselves in medical institutions, shaping the way Black patients have been treated for generations. The assumption that Black people feel less pain than white people did not die with Sims. It became a falsehood passed down through medical training, quietly influencing the way pain is assessed and treated. Studies have shown that Black patients are still more likely to have their pain underestimated or ignored by doctors. They are less likely to receive adequate pain management for injuries, surgeries, or chronic conditions. The echoes of Sims' beliefs are still present in hospitals, emergency rooms, and clinics today. Anarcha's suffering was not just an isolated injustice from the past, it was part of a larger pattern. The history of medicine is full of cases where Black bodies were used for experimentation without consent. The Tuskegee syphilis study, where Black men were deliberately left untreated for decades to observe the effects of the disease, is one example. The forced sterilizations of Black and Indigenous women well into the 20th century is another. Each of these cases follows the same unspoken logic that medical advancement could justify human suffering, as long as those suffering were not seen as equals. For decades, Sims's legacy went unquestioned. His defenders maintained that he had been a medical pioneer who made essential contributions to women's health. One of the most vocal supporters of this version of history was Dr. Seal Harris, a well-respected 20th century physician and historian. Harris wrote extensively about Sims, portraying him as a selfless surgeon who had helped Anarcha and the other enslaved women out of pure medical necessity. His accounts painted Sims as a benevolent figure who rescued these women from lifelong suffering rather than a man who exploited them for personal gain. Seal Harris's writings heavily influenced the way Sims was remembered throughout the 20th century. His book on Sims, published in 1950, shaped the narrative found in medical textbooks for decades. In this version of history, Anarcha was not a victim. She was a patient who had been cured and whose suffering had been justified in the name of scientific progress. Harris's work ignored the fact that Anarcha had continued to suffer from the same condition long after Sims claimed to have healed her. The medical community accepted this version of the story, and for generations, it was the only one widely taught. But truth doesn't stay buried forever. Over time, scholars and activists began debunking the harmful myths and uncovering the realities behind Sims' success. Researchers revisited his records and found the names of the enslaved women he experimented on. Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy were no longer faceless figures lost in history. They were real people who had endured unimaginable pain. As the truth became more widely known, so did the calls for accountability. The medical community was forced to acknowledge that many of its advancements were built on suffering. In 2018, the statue of Sims in Central Park was taken down, an act of recognition that his legacy was not just one of medical breakthroughs, but of exploitation. Still, removing a statue is not the same as justice. It does not erase the harm. It does not change the fact that Sims' name still appears in medical textbooks, while Anarcha's remains largely unknown. And it does not undo the years of medical mistrust that have built up in Black communities because of abuses like the ones she endured. Medicine must do more than remember. It must learn. It must confront the ways in which racial bias continues to shape treatment and outcomes. It must acknowledge not only the harms of the past, but the ways those harms still manifest today. Honoring Anarcha means changing the way medicine operates so that no one else is treated as she was. Anarcha Westcott was not just a test subject in someone else's breakthrough. She was a person who felt every cut, every failure, every moment of suffering forced upon her. Her name should not exist only in the margins of medical history, buried beneath the accomplishments of the man who exploited her pain. It should be spoken with the recognition that she was more than what was done to her. For too long, her story was treated as a necessary sacrifice, a cruel but inevitable step toward progress. But there was nothing necessary about what happened to her. The surgeries she endured were experiments conducted without care for her suffering. The progress made in gynecology was built on a system that devalued her humanity. Remembering Anarcha is not just about looking back. It is about recognizing the injustices that still persist. Medicine continues to struggle with racial bias. The same flawed beliefs that allowed Sims to operate without anesthesia still influence treatment decisions today. Acknowledging her story serves as an act of historical reflection, a demand for change, a way to reclaim the humanity that was denied to her in life, and a reminder that progress must never come at the cost of those who are powerless to refuse it. Anarcha Westcott, Anna K. Jackson. She lived, she suffered, and she mattered. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video inspiring, consider sharing it so more people can learn the truth behind this powerful story. And if you want to see more content that uncovers hidden history and challenges the narratives we've been told, don't forget to like and subscribe. Were there any hidden details we missed? Or did her story touch you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, keep uncovering, keep questioning, and never let the forgotten stay forgotten.